So we'll go back to the text. We come to Abraham, and what we have here, what we have with Abraham is really one man against the world, right? The world's descending down. We have God's covenant with Abraham. Remember, the covenants are our backbone. I'm arguing we had a covenant with Adam. We have a covenant with Noah. Now we have a covenant with Abraham. So what I have here is what humans tried to get at Babel. God promised Abraham a great name, a great nation, a kingdom. So when he says, I'm going to make you a great nation, it's a word we can fly over quickly, right? But nation means kingdom. So he's promising him a kingdom and a blessing, and that Abraham would be a blessing for the whole world. So in that sense, right, Abraham is a new Adam. Obviously, there's not absolute continuity, but that's very important to see. Abraham is a new Adam. He's going to be the means by which the blessing comes to the whole world. He's going to reclaim the world through Abraham. I think another important thing to see is that Abraham isn't chosen because he's so virtuous. This is a very important verse for me. Joshua said to all the people, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. Abraham was an idolater before he was called. He wasn't a godly man. And I think of Romans chapter 4, verse 5, speaking of Abraham, God justifies the ungodly, which is, we probably won't return to that again. You know, Jewish tradition, the Jewish tradition about Abraham, if you read in Second Temple Jewish literature, Abraham is continually praised for his godliness in that literature, understandably in some ways. Jubilees, in the book of Jubilees, one of these pseudepigraphical books, in the book of Jubilees, Abraham is praised as perfect, perfect in his obedience. But Paul in Romans 4:5 says that God justifies the ungodly, showing that Abraham himself was an ungodly person, that he didn't belong to God natively. So God calls Abraham as an ungodly one, as to be the means by which the world will be blessed. So we see the elements of the covenant. We have the land, which is Canaan, right? But that points to a new Eden, right? Canaan or Palestine is, so to speak, going to be God's garden. We have the offspring, Isaac. And of course, this is related to Genesis 1:28. The blessing is to be fruitful and multiply and to have children. You know, just incidentally, that dominion still exists today through having children. I do not argue, by the way, you have to have as many children as possible. But you know that there are societies facing a crisis that's coming because they're not having enough children. Russia, for example, do you know about that? Russia's facing a great crisis. Italy, Japan, because they're not having enough children. And of course, how are the older people going to be supported as time goes on? The United States isn't facing that problem to the same degree, and one of the reasons is because we have many immigrants coming in. But populations, you know, to sustain themselves, they need to have enough children. Even that's one of the reasons China has gone right, at least for having 2 children. So you know, there's some relevance even to today in an extended sense. What's very interesting in terms of the offspring, you could miss it in the story, but you do see in the story that we're told that kings will come from Abraham. So that's quite interesting to see, isn't it? It's not just offspring in general, but kings. And then we, as we read the story, we go fast as we go, but the promise is through Isaac and not Ishmael, isn't it? It's not, as Romans 9 says, it's not all the children of Abraham. It's not all his physical children who are the covenant children. There's a discriminating process going on there. The promise is through Isaac and not Ishmael. Isn't it fascinating when God tells Abraham in Genesis 17, by the way, that's the chapter where he's promised he'll be the father of many nations, right? Where he's circumcised. When God tells Abraham that, do you remember what Abraham says? He says, let Ishmael live before you. What is Abraham basically saying there? Abraham's basically saying, thank you very much, but we don't need Isaac. Ishmael's just fine. Sarah and I are quite content for it to happen this way. But that's not God's plan. So Abraham's quite content with it to go a different way. So God's plan and Abraham's plan are not the same. That comes out again in Genesis 21, which is cited in the New Testament twice. You know the story. This is the story when Abraham circumcises Isaac, right? And where is it? Verse. Sarah saw the son mocking the one Hagar, the Egyptian, had born to Abraham. Of course, that's where Galatians picks it up. Galatians picks it up, saying the mocking is a form of persecution, right? Galatians 4, that's picked up. So Sarah says to Abraham, drive out this slave with her son, for the son of the slave will not be co-heir with my son Isaac. Of course, the New Testament picks up that citation, doesn't it? That is the word of the Lord. Sarah is speaking God's word. Now, I actually think at the same time, Sarah has a bad attitude. It's a complex reality. Sarah is actually speaking the right thing, but her attitude is not good. She's actually sinning. She's actually sinning, but what she's saying is true. God works in surprising ways, doesn't he? Sometimes. No excuse for Sarah's bad attitude, and yet what she says is true. Ishmael and Isaac aren't heirs together. God said to Abraham, do not be distressed about the boy and about your slave. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. There it is. The promise comes through Isaac. And my wife says that this is her life verse in the Bible. I'm just kidding. She has never said that to me in her whole life. But whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her. That is the favorite verse of all wives. No, I'm making that up. Anyway. So Isaac is the only son, right? Genesis 22 says, Genesis 22, what a fascinating chapter that is. You know, I wish we could linger on all these, but he's told to sacrifice Isaac, not to murder him, right? It's not a murder, it's a sacrifice to God. So he's told to sacrifice Isaac, offer him up to God as a sacrifice. And Hebrews tells us that by that time, Abraham was convinced that God would raise him from the dead if he killed him. So obviously, that'd still be a very hard thing to do, right? To plunge a knife into your son. And yet, we see a hint of that in Genesis 22, right? You see that in the story. Genesis 22, verse 4, Abraham says in verse 4, we're going to go here and we're going to return. I don't think those are throwaway words. He says, we're going to go and we're going to return. He knows Isaac is coming back with him. He knew by then that the promise had to be through Isaac. He knew the promise wasn't Isaac or maybe somebody else who comes along. No, it would be through Isaac. That God would even raise him from the dead. So yeah, the offspring now, the offspring is channeled through Isaac and not Ishmael. Here's the other thing. The story, we want to think of the lineaments of the story. It takes so long for Abraham to have a single son who's the son of the promise. And that the point of the story is clearly that the promise would be fulfilled through a miracle, right? It's going to take a miracle. Abraham doesn't have the potential, the ability, even the virility to have the children on his own. Genesis 17 is the father of many nations, but he can't even have one son on his own. And by the way, I think that's one of the reasons for circumcision. You know, why circumcision? Circumcision, I think, signifies dedication to God. But I also think circumcision indicates, in a very, practical way, every time, I don't want to be crass, every time Abraham went to the bathroom, so to speak, right, he would recognize my ability to have children. It was a sex organ after all. My ability to have children comes from God. God promised that I'd be the father of many nations, same chapter, circumcision, right? That's God's grace in his life, that he has the children. What do we think about the Abrahamic covenant? Is it conditional or unconditional? Here I agree with Gentry and Wellham and others, they're not the only ones, that it's both. It's unconditional and conditional. I mean, I was raised in a tradition that said the Abrahamic covenant is only unconditional. But I think it's clearly both. When the covenant is enacted in Genesis 15, God passes through the animals alone as a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, right? The animals are cut up and you go between them. Well, you all know this. You know this passage, right, in Jeremiah? I just read this in my Bible reading the other day, where it's very helpful for interpreting Genesis. The Israelites freed the Hebrew slaves and they took it back. We won't worry about that. But as for those who disobeyed my covenant, not keeping the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat them like the calf they cut in two in order to pass between its pieces. So that's what you do, a covenant ceremony. You cut up the animals, you pass between the pieces with your other covenant partner, and but they broke the covenant, and Yahweh says, the officials of Judah and Jerusalem, the court officials, the priests, and all the people of the land who pass between the pieces of the calf, all these I will hand over to their enemies, to those who intend to take their life. Their corpses will become food for the birds of the sky and for the wild animals of the land. If you violate the covenant, you'll become like those animals, right? Cut up, destroyed. And that's the covenant ceremony. But God passes through the pieces alone in Genesis 15, bringing upon himself a self-malediction, right? A self-malediction, a curse on himself, perhaps anticipating the cross if the covenant isn't fulfilled. So ultimately, the covenant with Abraham will be fulfilled. In that sense, it's unconditional. It will be fulfilled. No, there is no way this covenant will be revoked. So there's going to be offspring, right? There's going to be land, God's king over a place, and there's going to be a universal blessing. I haven't talked that much about universal blessing. That will certainly happen. But in another sense, the covenant is conditional. God calls Abraham to obey. Desi Alexander, by the way, the D-Min class yesterday had a Q&A with Desi Alexander. Do you know Desi's work? T. Desmond Alexander. He's done a lot, and he's written this book, From Paradise to the Promised Land. Do you know that book? That's a very nice book on the theology of the Pentateuch. How many have read it? So, yeah, one of you has read it. Great book, don't you agree? And he's written a book on the servant. Well, he's written lots of things. I can't even remember them all. So he's just a great author. By the way, we're doing a commentary series for Brodman and Holman on biblical theology, and Desi's the Old Testament editor for it. So Desi does great work in biblical theology. Anyway, he says, first, the fulfillment of the divine promises is conditional upon Abraham's obedience. So we see Abraham leaving. We have an exodus from Ur and Haran. So the covenant begins here. Chapter 15 is very important because we see the covenant with Abraham depends on his faith, right? Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. When was Abraham declared to be right before God? I think in Genesis 12, right? When he obeyed, when he went to the land. You with me? I think he was right with God when he went into the land. But that going into the land was based on faith. Hebrews 11:8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and set out for a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. So Abraham's faith didn't begin in Genesis 15, did it? It was already there in Hebrews 11. What Genesis 15 is telling us is that the means by which Abraham was right with God was finally not his obedience, but his faith. I mean, obviously, because those are, faith and obedience have an integral relationship, an inseparable relationship. But the foundation of his relationship with God is his faith, not his obedience. Okay, I've talked about some of these things. The blessing comes because Abraham obeyed the sacrifice of Isaac. Let's read a couple of these passages, because you always want to see it in the text. After he, I guess we should say attempts to sacrifice Isaac, agrees to do it. Yahweh says, by myself I have sworn. This is the Lord's declaration, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son. I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. There's the offspring, right? And the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gate of their enemies. There's the kingdom, right? And all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring. There's the universal blessing. Because you've obeyed my voice. The blessing is contingent upon his obedience. We see it again in Genesis 26:5. Pick it up at verse 4. Now this is said to Isaac. I'll give you all these lands. I'll confirm the oath. So there's land, right? We should see that. I'll confirm the oath that I swore to Abraham. I'll make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. There's offspring. All the nations of the earth will be blessed. Why? Because Abraham listened to me and kept my mandate, my commands, my statutes, and my instructions. So clearly the text is saying the blessing came because Abraham obeyed. So that's very important to see. I do think Desi Alexander goes astray. If you read From Paradise to Promised Land, at one point I think he goes astray because he actually speaks of Abraham as meriting the promises. He uses the word merit. I was shocked by that. That book is so good, but he actually uses the word merit. I think that's a misstep, don't you? It's his faith, not merit. We ought not to speak of merit. Perhaps Desi would just say, I'm speaking of reward. But I think given the theological associations with the word merit, it's just not a helpful word to use. So, we're not surprised then, since obedience is necessary, we're not surprised that James picks this up. We'll return to this later, maybe, where James says there's justification by works, right? Obviously, that doesn't contradict Paul, but you can see the stream in biblical theology that works are necessary. Works are necessary to receive the blessing. I mean, what sense are they necessary? Well, we already know that the works flow out of faith, don't we? But clearly, the works are necessary. James himself says there's justification by works. Well, that fits with what we see in terms of the conditionality of the covenant. Anything you want to say on that issue? Any questions or comments? That the covenant, so that's a very important theme. The covenant is both conditional and unconditional. Ultimately, it's unconditional. But for any particular individual, it's conditional. Right? Make sense? You with me? Okay? So, the promise goes on, the preservation of offspring. So for the promise to be fulfilled, there must be offspring, there must be children, right? And we see the battle between the seeds. The offspring are threatened when Sarah is sold into harems. So that happens twice, right? Genesis 12, Genesis 20. What's the significance of that in the story? The significance of that in the story is, especially in Genesis 12, if Sarah is in Pharaoh's harem, the child's going to come through Sarah and Abraham. So the Sarah being taken by another man threatens the promise. Of course, Abraham disbelieves here, but God's going to fulfill his promise, isn't he? He inflicts disease on Pharaoh and threatens to kill Abimelech. So he's going to see that promise as fulfilled in his sovereignty. The promise is also threatened by Eliezer becoming the heir. So remember who Eliezer is. Eliezer is Abraham's servant. And in chapter 15, Abraham laments that the promise will be fulfilled through Eliezer rather than his own son. And that's when God says, definitely not in Los Angeles, right? Go outside and look at the stars. I mean, can you see stars here? Too many lights, right? But go outside and look at the stars, and that's how your offspring are going to be as uncountable as the stars. Isn't that we take that story for granted, but that's an amazing promise. He can't even have one kid. And now he's saying you're going to have as many, your offspring are going to be as uncountable as the stars. And of course, that's us, right? We're part of that offspring in this room. We're part of the fulfillment of that promise made to Abraham. Every believer is a child of Abraham. That's what Paul teaches us in Galatians 3 and Romans 4, doesn't he? We're all children of Abraham. I mean, Abraham believed that promise, but surely even Abraham could not have conceived how great the fulfillment would be. And we'll enjoy talking to him about that someday when we meet Abraham. The promise is also threatened by Ishmael, right? As I already said, they're quite content with Ishmael. Also, you wonder, the story is told in such a way that it takes a very long time for Abraham to have a child, but what about the land promise? And I like Acts chapter 7, verse 5, where Stephen says Abraham didn't even get a foot of land. So God gave him this great promise. You have uncountable offspring. You're going to possess the land. You're going to be a blessing for the whole world. What did Abraham actually see in his life? He had one son. And he didn't, and as Stephen says, he didn't even have a foot of the land. The only land he ends up getting is a place to bury Sarah. That's the only land he possessed. So, just a pastoral word there. Right? God gives us great promises. But the circumstances in our lives may be such. I mean, maybe it's already happened to you, or maybe you're young enough you haven't experienced this yet. But the circumstances in our lives can turn in a way that you may begin to think, well, what about all those promises? My life hasn't turned out at all the way I thought it would. This is not what God promised me. But remember Abraham. Abraham had these great promises, but I don't think they were fulfilled in the way and in the timing he expected. So remember that when the sufferings come, because if they haven't already come, they're going to come. And I have talked to people, maybe you have too, who will say to me, I can't follow the Lord because even though I did, I'm giving it up because my life's just too hard. This is not what I signed up for. I'm going to go another way. And Abraham trusted God, right? In the midst of that. As Hebrews says, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were nomads. They lived in tents. They waited for the promise. God gave these great promises to them, but they really didn't see them as being fulfilled, and yet they kept trusting God. So that's a great lesson for us. Okay. The battle between the offspring continues. There's a promise of land and offspring and blessing. It's reiterated to Isaac and to Jacob. And we already saw Isaac, not Ishmael. Jacob, but not Esau, which very interesting, right? Paul picks that up in Romans chapter 9. We won't return to that passage again in this class, but that's a most fascinating passage where I don't know if you know the work of Brian Abbassiano. Brian Abbassiano, he's an Arminian. He's written 3 volumes on Romans 9 now, trying to prosecute. Brian's a great guy, a wonderful person. I've met Brian, but he's trying to prosecute an Arminian reading of Romans chapter 9 in a very sophisticated way. So if you're ever working in Romans 9, you need to look at Brian's work. I'm revising my Romans commentary, and I've interacted with the first 2 volumes. I'm not going to be able to do the third because it's going to be going to press, and I haven't been able to get my hands on it. But it'll be more of the same. I already know his stream. But I just want to say here, the promise isn't given to Jacob, isn't because he's such a nice brother. He's such a great guy. He's so much more godly than Esau. Clearly, that's not the point of the story, is it? The point of the story is that Jacob himself is quite evil. What are the obstacles to the promise? A godly wife for Isaac, right? So Genesis 24 is a very long chapter. I mean, what's the point of that chapter? The point of that chapter is that a wife is given to Isaac who's godly. So the seed can be preserved, right? The offspring can be preserved. Both Rebekah and Rachel are barren. Isaac lies like Abraham. God protects. Twice in the story, first Esau threatens to kill Jacob. So Esau stands what? For the offspring of the serpent. You know, really, it's really the same story over and over again, isn't it? The offspring of the serpent want to kill the people of God. That's what Esau wants to do in chapter 27. Then Laban threatens Jacob's return to the land in chapter 31. Then as they're coming back to the land in chapter 32, Jacob fears, doesn't he? Jacob fears the wrath of Esau. As you read that story, remember how he splits them up into camps to meet Esau? Because Esau's coming with 400 men, and Jacob is filled with terror that Esau is going to come and kill him and all his children and wipe out the children of the promise. But God so works that Esau is friendly to him, right? The story of Dinah and Shechem is a very interesting story as well. What's the point of that story? The point of that story is that the Shechemites want to intermarry with the Israelites, and that would corrupt the seed, right? That would be intermarrying with the offspring of the serpent. So the point to that story is God works, because remember, Shechem rapes Dinah and then wants to marry her, falls in love with her, and then they have this plan. We'll intermarry together. We'll intermarry, but the Israelites, Jacob's children, say, we'll only do it if you get circumcised. Do you remember this story? We'll only do it if you get circumcised. But their plan is, and they carry it out once they're circumcised and incapacitated for military action, Simeon and Levi come in with servants, probably, and kill them all. So that's a quite interesting story at a number of levels. We see an interesting example of God's sovereignty, because God did not want them to marry the Shechemites. So through this incident, the purity of Israel is preserved. They don't marry the Shechemites. For the author of Genesis, I think it's Moses, for the author of Genesis, that's a good thing. The purity of Israel is preserved. On the other hand, Simeon and Levi were sinning. What they did was wrong. And we see later in Genesis, at the end of the book, that because of that, they are not given an allotment in the land. Right? So the actions that they undertook are not blessed by God. And because of that, there's a punishment. But furthermore, the story operates at a number of levels. Because of what they've done, now Jacob fears that Israel will be wiped out by other tribal groups in the land, because they know about the outrage that has been perpetrated by the brothers. So the very action by which they preserve the seed also threatens the offspring. Do you see? So you see the complexity of the story. It's operating at a number of levels. What's the hermeneutical lesson for us? We need to be careful when we tell a story not to oversimplify it, right? This story operates at a number of levels. God is sovereignly working out his purposes, yet the brothers are doing what is evil, and we have to wrap that all into the story. The ultimate lesson for us, of course, is God is working out his sovereign purposes, isn't he? God is working out his sovereign purposes in this amazing situation.